Story 1. They legitimately had us watching it in class when I was in the fourth grade. I was not really sure it was real until I looked at my teacher, and the look on her face made me think the world was ending. Story 2. Just waking up for the day at 18 years old and watching it all unfold on television. The second plane hit just seconds after I tuned in. I remember it taking several minutes to even comprehend what was happening. It was on every channel, seriously though. Every single one. It was also 3 days before my 19th birthday, so that was difficult. The United States of America of the late 90s was bright, colorful, and optimistic. It has been bleak and gray ever since, with some flickers, but nothing lasting. It blows my mind that there are now full-grown adults who have no concept of the world before September 11th. You all would have loved it. I just realized that September 11th happened right before my 19th birthday, so I was 18 at the time. Story 3. Standing on the corner of First Avenue and Houston Street in New York City waiting for my bus to get to work. As I arrived at the bus stop from my apartment on Orchard Street, I noticed everyone was already looking up at the smoke pouring out of the first tower. The view from that corner bus stop to the Twin Towers was unobstructed. Then we watched the second plane hit about 2 minutes later. A woman next to me screamed and started wailing. People were confused and shocked. I still continued on to work, which to this day I cannot figure out why I did. Story 4. Retired air traffic controller. I worked at an airport in North Carolina. I was on duty the day before until 1 a.m. I was in bed sleeping the next morning when a coworker called to tell me a plane had hit the World Trade Center. I turned on the television just in time to see the second plane hit. I went to work at 1 p.m. There were barricades at the airport entrance and armed security. I got into the tower, and there were no airplanes in the sky, just a few military helicopters. Story 5. I was 21 years old and working in a furniture factory when, all of a sudden, all of the machines started to shut down around me. I did not know why, and everybody was yelling to be quiet. Then one person turned up the radio, and that is when we heard it. We were sent home for the day. The world has been darker since then. Story 6. I was late to work that day. I had just enough time to run away from my office that was at the moment falling down all around me. On September 11th, I had the day off and went running. Story 7. I was at work in the factory and spent the rest of the day wondering when my unit would be called. My former commanding officer had just started his new assignment at the Pentagon. It was not until 9 p.m. that night that I found out he was wounded but alive. Story 8. I was in school. I remember my mother picking me up and being terrified because my father was on a flight at the exact same time as this happened, with no way of contacting him until his flight was grounded. It was a horrible feeling. Story 9. News on television. Getting ready to go to work. Planes crashing. I wondered why network television was showing a movie in the morning instead of news. Then, oh no. Story 10. I was just back in Minnesota from staying with a friend in New York City. I was running down the West Side Highway to the financial district the day before. Story 11. Coming home from school in Spain at 2 p.m. I was ready as always to have lunch while watching The Simpsons. However, that day there was no Simpsons on the TV, only the Twin Towers, and one of them was on fire. I turned the volume up just in time to see the second tower get hit. Story 12. I was a senior in high school and was in music class when the teacher turned on the news. We all watched the second plane hit, and everyone cheered when they announced early dismissal. Story 13. I had buried my child the day before. I woke up to my mother-in-law banging on my door, telling me to watch the television. Story 14. I was 3 weeks into Army basic training. That whole day is seared into my mind, starting with the abrupt announcement. They only let us into the drill sergeant day room after 6 p.m., where we caught a highlight of the second tower falling. Story 15. I'm going to post this every time I see this question. I was visiting. It was surreal, then sad, then monotonous, and surreal, and sad. I live in Los Angeles but worked for a company based in New York City and was there for a regular work trip. I was supposed to leave that afternoon, so I was taking my time at my Midtown hotel, getting ready in the morning, showering and listening to Howard Stern when the first plane hit. I got out of the shower and watched on TV when the second plane hit. I didn't know what to do, so I got dressed and went to the office. I stopped to get coffee in the lobby of our building. A woman in line in front of me had no idea what had happened. "What do you mean?" she said as I told her 2 planes hit the towers. "My sister works there." She pulled out her phone and took off down the street. When I got to the office, about half the people were there. Almost all were watching TV in the conference room. We sat and watched as the towers fell. We tried to get whatever information we could. Some of us tried to volunteer to give blood or help responders. The only information was to stay away from downtown. They closed the office at noon. Everybody else went home. I didn't know what to do. I knew some people in the city, but they were tough to get a hold of. Cell service was spotty, overwhelmed with demand. My understanding is there were a number of cell antennas on the towers. I went back to my hotel, extended my reservation, and changed clothes. I had nothing to do, so a coworker and I just walked. We headed downtown instinctively. Walking down the middle of Fifth Avenue with no cars was just plain bizarre. We got to Houston Street, and the police blocked us from going any further. We happened, by chance, to run into a friend of mine, and we went to his apartment, ordered Chinese food, and watched television. We went back to the hotel and then started a cycle that would repeat itself for the next 5 days. Watch the news to see if the airports were going to open, realize the answer was no, then find something to do with the day. We tried on numerous occasions to find some way to volunteer, but there just wasn't anything to do. We couldn't get anywhere near the site to help first responders. As the days wore on, the saddest part was that there weren't any survivors. No need for blood. No need for help in the hospitals. Here's the thing I remember about that week. The weather was gorgeous. It was the beautiful, cloudless, crisp fall days that make New York City such an amazing place to be. But then the smoke started wafting. I'm not being overly dramatic when I say that the stench of death was in the air. The whole city smelled of fire. I don't remember everything I did that week. Imagine a whole week with nothing to do in one of the greatest cities in the world. But it happened because this enormous, incomprehensible destruction was visited upon us by evil people. I guess I spent my week trying to internalize that. And I walked the city. I would stop in bars, the only businesses that were reliably open that week, and watch television news, and drink, and cry, and try to figure out what comes next. I just wanted to go home. I just wanted to get out. I was dealing with something I couldn't digest. It was impossible to get my head around, especially after the first couple of days when the world didn't end. It was more confusing that this cataclysm was done to us and the world didn't stop spinning. I knew it would be history, but I had no idea what it meant as it unfolded. What was the world going to look like? Would there be war? How do we figure this out? Oh, and by the way, the command and control center of our military was hit. The world was insane, but nothing had happened to me. I still had to eat, and wear clothes, and deal with the airlines so I could figure out a way to get home. It's not much of a story. I'm at least 2 degrees away from anyone who was killed. I was close to history, but not personally impacted, really. I've never felt more helpless, small, and impotent. I was a witness, period. Trapped in the strangest place I've ever been. I think about it all the time. Story 16. On September 11th, I woke up early for school but ended up skipping that day with my best friend Jose. We smoked a blunt on my Brooklyn rooftop in Sunset Park, where we could clearly see the Twin Towers. The skies were clear as we enjoyed the scenery like we did most mornings. Afterward, we walked 3 avenues down to his sister's house. On our way there, particles fell onto our clothes, and we thought we were imagining things because we were high. We didn't know at the time, but it was ashes from the first tower being hit. As soon as we got to his sister's house and opened the door, we saw the second tower being hit on the TV facing the front door. We took a cab before everything got locked down to Red Hook. There, we went to our friend's rooftop where the towers were much closer. We smoked endless blunts while watching the towers collapse in shock, crying and terrified. Phones didn't work. Trains and buses shut down. It was chaotic. My mom worked for the New York Times back then, and her depot was located on the West Side Highway, not far from the towers. I didn't hear from her for 2 days. Brooklyn was full of ashes. The skies were dark gray for days. Those were wild times. I remember how sensitive we were to hearing planes months after. Post-traumatic stress disorder was real. Story 17. I was a United States Army sergeant stationed in Bamberg, Germany. There was an epic showing of support over the next 24 hours. Flowers were stacked as tall as the front gate. Story 18. I was driving to the Rayburn House office building on Interstate 395 North, listening to National Public Radio talk with great uncertainty about the attacks in New York. At that time, no one was certain what was going on. As I drove by the Pentagon, I saw a plume of black smoke rising hundreds of feet into the air. That was the moment I realized something serious was happening. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew it was bad. I tried making several phone calls, but the circuits were jammed. When I got to Capitol Hill, people were streaming out of all the office buildings, including the Rayburn. I just kept driving, taking an alternative route home, avoiding the Pentagon. Story 19. I was working at the Federal Aviation Administration Technical Center in Pomona, New Jersey, just outside of Atlantic City. It is the second largest Federal Aviation Administration installation outside of Washington, D.C. I worked in the En route Air Traffic Control Division, AOS 360, troubleshooting the air traffic control systems that guide planes once they leave airport control. I was one of about 1,000 contractors working alongside at least that many federal employees. After the first plane hit the World Trade Center, my boss called a group of us into his office to watch it on his television. While we were there, the Pentagon was hit. You could hear phones ringing all over the second floor. Trust me, it was not a good time. Until they figured out that the planes had been taken over, we thought there was a huge breakdown of the air traffic control system. Why did Long Island send a plane over Manhattan? Kind of questions. The Pentagon plane incident ended that line of thinking, luckily. The nationwide landing call and ground stop went out soon after. Every plane in United States airspace was on the ground within a couple of hours with no issues, which was somewhat of a miracle. Planes coming in over water were diverted to Canada or Mexico, if I recall correctly. There were over 4,000 commercial flights in the air at the time. The Federal Aviation Administration executive who gave the order to halt all air traffic in the country was on his first day on the job. All the contractors were sent home at about 10 a.m., just before the towers fell. I was listening to the radio on my way home hearing that. The next day, every car coming in had bumper-to-bumper inspections and so on. My contract was not renewed in April 2002, so they could divert budget money to people inspecting sneakers. It was the most momentous day of my life, without a doubt, even more than the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Story 20. I was in a child and family studies class at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. The professor came in and told us what happened. Years later, I gave birth to my daughter on September 11th because no one else wanted that date for induction. Story 21. In the family car being driven to school, the crossing guard flagged us down and told my dad, "School is closed today. Go home and turn on the news." We did not have electricity at the time, so we drove to the bar where my mom worked. As we switched on the news, there was video of the plane hitting the second tower. Story 22. I find some of these responses from people who were not yet born or very young to be trivializing and disrespectful. 3,000 people died that day, and believe it or not, it changed the course of your life. I do not care if you were very young at the time, it traumatized a generation. You should be aware of that fact. I lost people in this attack. Please save your sarcasm for something more appropriate. Story 23. I was working at a mechanical shop in New Jersey, 10 minutes from there. I was actually in the building 2 days before. You can see everything from my second-story window. Story 24. Just woke up and was doing a wake and bake before work at the restaurant. Put on the news and couldn't believe what I was seeing. We were super slow except our bars were full all day because of televisions. We saw the second plane hit and the buildings crumble. It's still unreal that happened. Story 25. I was in London on a work assignment for a news bureau. When the planes hit, I was in a garden with a peacock roaming around. It wasn't until I got back to the office that I learned what happened, and I couldn't comprehend it. I was stunned and sickened by what I was witnessing as a native New Yorker. The people in Britain were kind to me, but I got drunk for the rest of my stay, which was prolonged by a week. All planes were delayed. I didn't know what to expect next. I was lucky to find a hotel to stay in. Everyone was scrambling. It was very difficult. My sister was in France, and she somehow contacted me to comfort me. I am getting emotional. Story 26. I was living on East 18th Street in Manhattan. I was up until 4:30 that morning, working on a presentation that would be shown to Bill Gates that day to secure additional funding for the project I was freelancing on. It was an early smartwatch called Silicon Personal Organizer and Tracker. My boss and his team were obviously in Seattle, 3 hours behind me. Throughout the evening, they kept requesting changes to the PowerPoint slides I was putting together. Finally, they were happy with the presentation at around 4:30 a.m., so I uploaded it to their server and went to bed. I woke up the next morning to my flip phone's LED flashing red, full of messages checking on my welfare. It was 10:30 a.m. The towers were already gone. I had slept through the entire event. I had some coffee and sat, groggy and dazed, with the television on in the background. A bit later, I left my apartment and went down to the street. First Avenue was a sea of people walking north, covered in white powder. I made my way to my local pizza shop. There was a line out the door of people getting slices. I went around them and asked my buddy behind the counter to make me 2 large plain cheese pizzas. I got the last 2 pies he had enough dough for. While waiting for the pizzas, I went to the deli next door and grabbed a 12-pack of Poland Spring bottled water. With the 2 hot pizzas and a 12-pack of water perched on top of them, I made my way to the 13th precinct on 21st Street. I don't even remember why I decided to do this. I was just on autopilot. I had no idea what to do, but I knew I had to do something. I remember walking into the front desk, putting the pizzas down, and immediately getting grilled on who I was and why I was there. I pointed to the pizzas and the water. "These are for you guys. I don't know what else to do." The officer on duty thanked me, and I turned and left. On my way out the door, I looked over my shoulder, and a bunch of officers had already descended on the boxes. I spent the better part of the following year breathing a vague whiff of smoldering embers and death, wafting uptown from the hellscape of Ground Zero. Story 27. I was in my middle school science class when it all happened. I remember everyone with their eyes glued to the television news and children being pulled out of school one after another. It was a very eerie day. Story 28. I was 12 years old and homeschooled. Around 11 a.m., my mom and I started driving to Kmart, and we heard it on the radio. Story 29. Working at an investment firm in Ohio, you could not pull up news on the internet because so many people were online. Customers called in but could not trade, so they would tell us the latest updates. This day was followed by nightly broadcasts of smoke continuing to come from the rubble. That lasted for over a month. People were the kindest I have ever seen. Story 30. I was 21 and working in a pharmacy in shipping and receiving. One of the delivery workers told me about the first plane hitting the tower. I thought nothing of it and continued to work as usual. But when I went into the break room and saw what was happening on television, I realized this was more serious than I had originally thought. Living near the airport, it was surreal to see all the flights landing. It was also very quiet, with no flights landing or taking off for the following few days. Story 31. Just getting home to Canada from a flight to Greece. I turned on the television and saw the Twin Towers with smoke billowing out of them. I was very lucky to get home when I did. They did not allow any airplanes in after the buildings were hit. Story 32. Living in California, I was still asleep before work. I was a low-level manager in a corporate job when things started. I had just gotten a mobile phone for work. Needless to say, it started going crazy with people on my team calling me, telling me to turn on the television, and asking me what they should do. I turned the television on just in time to see the second plane hit. I think that video has been played so many times that I might be misremembering, but that feels right. I also had a team member in training in New York City at the time. My roommate came out of their room laughing at me. Bet you hate having that thing now, huh? I just pointed at the television. Story 33. Getting ready to go to school in 5th grade. We heard it on the radio that my mom listened to every morning. She is American, and it was a huge moment. I am Canadian. She ran to turn on the news, and we watched it on TV. My mom was very emotional. Story 34. I was in a current events class as a senior in high school. The history teacher burst in to give the news. I looked up at the sky for the rest of the day. Story 35. Sitting in first period math in 8th grade. The history teacher next door came flying into our room, yelling about the first plane that hit. Our math teacher immediately turned on the news, and we saw the second plane hit live. Story 36. Sitting in my high school electronics class, my teacher and the graphics art teacher in the adjoining room were both veterans and close with each other. The teacher from next door ran into the room and said, "Turn on the television. We were just attacked," or something along those lines. Both classes then watched as the second plane hit. We all sat in silence for the rest of the class period, taking in what we had just witnessed. Those images have been seared into my memory. Story 37. I was working for a charity. I was with an American medical coordinator from Florida. We were close to the Afghanistan border. We woke up and I had to evacuate him. I thought it was a movie when I saw the news. Story 38. Getting ready to be deployed for September 11th. Since I had already re-enlisted and retrained for service, I was deployed immediately. Story 39. Playing outside with my brother. Then my mother called us in because she got scared. We do not even live in the United States, though. Watched the second plane crash into the tower as well and later saw them collapse. That event haunted me for weeks as a 10-year-old. Story 40. I was in high school at the time. Looking back, it was incredibly disturbing that we all sat and watched thousands of people die on live television. Story 41. High school library. Then people started to get up and leave after hearing whispers that school had been canceled. Everyone was walking to the bus stop when they heard that planes had crashed in New York City. When I got home, the television was on, and every single channel was showing images of the burning tower, including the Home Shopping Network. That's when you know things are serious, when even the Home Shopping Network paused regular programming. Story 42. At college. Saw many people watching a television that someone brought into the main hallway. Did not pay attention and went to class. Classes finished. Even more people were in the main hallway watching the television. Was not interested. Went home, got online. Story 43. I was recently laid off from my job and had just received a letter denying my unemployment claim. I was sleeping late after drinking late with some friends. Then my friend, who is also unemployed, called me and told me to turn on the television because the world is ending. Story 44. Having been asleep during the plane strikes, it was 5:45 a.m., and without television or radio between waking and arriving at school, I was walking into homeroom in 7th grade when the first tower collapsed. The principal announced over the public address system that all teachers were to pause class and turn on the television while we sheltered in place until further notice. Then, when the second tower collapsed a half hour later, school was canceled, and we were sent home. Story 45. I was not in my home country. I watched the news with my friend Dan. We both agreed it was the end of the happy days from then on. Story 46. I was 5 years old. I was one of, if not the only, child sitting in daycare that day watching the news as it was happening, thinking it was a movie while adults were crying. I even watched the second plane hit with my own two oblivious eyes. Mind you, I also watched Tim Burton's Mars Attacks prior to this happening, also while in daycare. Yes, this was a legitimate daycare, and no, I don't remember anything else other than these specific details. I am 28 and will turn 29 in October. Took years before I realized I witnessed history. Story 47. Walked into the living room and asked, "What movie is this?" Upon seeing the crash, there were silent stares, and then someone said, "It's the news." Story 48. Talking about that Friday's football opponent with our teacher, who was also our coach. Small school. Story 49. I was 3 months away from graduating college but had not started my professional job yet, which began in October. I was still working blue-collar, driving a truck and making deliveries. I first heard about the attacks on the sports radio show I listened to. I got on the Nextel phone we used to communicate with the shop, told the office manager to turn on the radio, because even after the first plane, I knew something big was happening. For those who remember those phones, which also functioned as walkie-talkies, they were very functional, though a little annoying for people nearby. They were also indestructible. I dropped mine many times. Story 50. I was in a college class. The professor told us the news and then continued with the lecture. It was a very confusing and terrifying moment. Story 51. Watching coverage with Real Player from Cable News Network from work in northern Canada. Being a couple of hours behind in time zones, both towers were down before I knew they had even been hit. Story 52. Working with no television or radio on, I was completely unaware of what happened until my business partner came and informed me. Story 53. I just got to school. It was on the televisions all over. The day was basically over and we just watched news coverage most of the day, if I recall correctly. I recently found out that one of my best friends, who had immigrated to the United States from Asia about a year or two before September 11th attacks, along with his friends, had their first job in the United States catering breakfast to the Twin Towers. He did that for a few years and left a month or two before the attacks. Super lucky. Story 54. Sleeping in because it was a half day at high school. I was in my senior year and decided half days were a waste of my time. I was mad because my dad woke me up early, and I said, "No, I am staying home today." He said, "Get up." A plane crashed into the World Trade Center. In my half-sleepiness, I thought he meant a plane crashed into my school. Story 55. My mom sent us to school as usual. I think there was only one other child left at school by the end of the day. Story 56. Just dropped my oldest off at kindergarten when my wife called and told me what had happened. Edit, fixed a typo. Story 57. In first grade, I was told to do the Pledge of Allegiance. School let out early. I went home and saw the plane crash on television and was very confused. Story 58. Sick leave from college. First, I clicked through the World Trade Center on fire during channel surfing because I thought it was some new movie promotion. Story 59. I was about 8 years old, so I did not understand. I was standing beside my father as we watched it on television. I thought it was a cool movie. Story 60. My almost 2-year-old son was sick, and it was my turn to stay home from work with him. I turned on the television just a couple of minutes before the second tower was hit. Story 61. Sleeping due to the time zone difference in my country. Woke up in the morning to my family staring at the television watching the news. Story 62. I was in 7th grade, sick at home, sitting there with a fever, and then all of a sudden we were under attack. Story 63. Well, I am kind of embarrassed, but I was with my current wife for the first time at her house in Pittsburgh, and we were doing what new lovers do. I did not know about September 11th until one of her friends called. Story 64. This question is difficult because it happened so long ago that young people were not even alive. They do not understand the unique culture of the 1990s or how much life changed after the events of September 11th, 2001. Story 65. On September 7th and September 10th, Michael Jackson gave 2 concerts at Madison Square Garden in New York, together with his brothers. That meant that many fans, possibly 30 or 40 that I knew of, from all over the world flocked to New York. I was one of them. We stayed up quite late on September 10th because there was a rumor that Michael was going to be at the tavern on the Green in Central Park. Turned out to be untrue, but it took a while to fall asleep that night. When we got up, 2 other girls from Munich and I, sharing a room near 45th Street. Everything had already happened, but we didn't know. You know how it is with breakfast. Cheap hotels don't include it, so you have to get it yourself. One of us took orders and went to the shop next door. The second still lounged in bed for a bit. I took a shower. When the first friend returned, I heard her turn on the television. She did this because she quickly noticed something was going on but wasn't sure what. The store had the radio on, And at first she thought they were talking about a new movie. Then she saw the reaction of the other people all trying to make phone calls, which didn't work because the antenna was on the World Trade Center. This was something we normally didn't do at that time of day. Television was usually for the afternoon and evening back then. I found it annoying but decided to see what was so important before complaining. I looked and saw a plane flying into a skyscraper on a news report. I didn't understand at first and wanted my tea and muffin. Took a while to register. That was when our vacation ended. Even though we were trapped in New York for several more days. I had booked my flight back to Europe for Saturday, and it left as planned. Many other fans had booked earlier flights. Some Spanish fans still got out. They had a flight early in the morning of September 11th. Others left for the airport but returned after 2 or 3 hours because their flights had been rescheduled by a couple of days. Trying to call home was a nightmare. The phone booths kept spitting out my quarters. I didn't understand. I put in $2 or $3 in quarters and it spit them all back out. The collect call did not work from a phone booth either. I had a mobile phone, one of my first, but it did not work in the United States. You needed a special type of phone for that. There were dual-band phones which worked in Europe. Tri-band phones worked in the United States as well. Mine was dual-band, so I had left it at home. Eventually, I asked at reception if I could make a collect call from their phone. They told me to buy a phone card from the shop next door. I did, and with the phone card, it worked. Story 66. Sleeping in a dorm, I woke up and saw it. I had a feeling then it was a big deal but a scam, though I never expressed this in any way until much later. I didn't think of it as an inside job, just a massive scheme played on everyone beyond the jets and buildings, but something else we have not fully recognized yet. Story 67. Just got to 6th grade history class. The first class of the day. The teacher wheeled the huge television cart in front and put on the news. I think we went home early that day shortly after. Story 68. I was in science class in 9th grade when our teacher came in and said, "There's a rumor a plane hit the Twin Towers." Story 69. I was in grade 8. I saw something on the television about a plane crash in New York City. I showed up late for school, and the next thing I saw was my social studies teacher write the name Osama bin Laden on the whiteboard. She said, "They believe this is the mastermind behind the attack." That was all I ever saw on the news for the next 5 years. Story 70. A mere cell. A puny life form made for nothing else but to exist and feed these political figures and their egos. A life form so worthless and insignificant that any feeling for me has ceased. A realm in which the unborn shall rest until their upbringing. I did not exist. Story 71. I had just walked my children to school. When I came home, I turned the television onto the Today Show and saw the first plane hit. Story 72. I was leaving gym class in the 10th grade when we were walking back to the other building, and everyone was going home. We had no idea what happened. Story 73. I was just out of the Navy at the time, and I stayed on the West Coast instead of going home after my service was done. I woke up a bit early to drive down to the dry cleaners. I was picking up some clothes for my then girlfriend. The lady at the counter asked if I had heard that planes hit the World Trade Center. I told her that I hadn't and never gave it a second thought. I drove home and my girlfriend at the time was in the shower, so I decided to turn on the news to see what was happening. I was shocked and later realized that I had to go to work, which just so happened to be on the base. After some time, I sat on the Coronado Bridge for 3 hours trying to get onto Naval Air Station, North Island. Those were the longest 3 hours of my life. At the time, we had no way of knowing what would happen next or what else might be a target. Story 74. I was in the gym working out and watching it happen as if it were not real. We kept asking if this was live or a movie. Story 75. Funny, I just had this conversation with my girlfriend. Anyway, I was leaving the principal's office for a dress code violation. Story 76. I was sitting in a baby bouncer at 2 years old or younger in front of the television while my family watched it downstairs. Story 77. I was sick and missed school. My brother had just started college, came home, and woke me up telling me the United States of America were under attack. We live in Canada. It was a pretty surreal thing to wake up to. Story 78. Going to class after sleeping 4 hours following a swing shift security job. The mood on campus was subdued, with a surreal calm. Story 79. Ordering breakfast at the university. My professor was the one who broke the news to me. I will never forget that moment. Story 80. Attending my first week of college. Classes were canceled that day, and everything felt very pointless for a while after that. Story 81. On a plane from London to Los Angeles. After more than 9 hours, we ended up back in London. It was after 11:30 p.m. We were told what had happened right as the plane reached the gate at Heathrow. I feel like we were the last people to hear about it. Surreal and horrifying, just as it was for everyone that day. Story 82. In college, on my way to an internship, I heard on the radio show that they thought a small plane had hit one of the towers. Story 83. Skipping school, I faked being sick to play video games. I went downstairs to make lunch, and my parents were watching it on television. Story 84. I was in 8th grade. We had sectional practice sessions in band before school, so I was doing that. As we were packing up to head to first period, we heard about the first plane hitting the World Trade Center. I think it was during first period class that we heard about the second plane. The rest of the day was kind of a mess, with teachers not really bothering to teach and just talking about the situation, with some classes having a television wheeled in and us watching the news. I remember I was reading Tom Clancy's Patriot Games at the time and feeling awkward walking around carrying this big hardback book with a picture of an AK-47 on the front of it. Story 85. Junior year of high school. West Coast. Watched all of it on the news live that morning, then drove to school. We did not get a lot done. We mostly watched the news all day. I still think about how we all went about our day, hoping for no more attacks. I feel like today school would have been closed. Story 86. Playing hooky for my job in the airline industry to drive over state lines in order to cheat on my boyfriend. I had called in with a migraine about an hour before the first plane hit. Story 87. It was the first week of my freshman year of college. I went to my morning class. When that was over, the news had broken. We were not sure if classes were canceled for the rest of the day. We sat around the biggest television in the richest kid's dorm room to watch the news and saw both towers fall live. It was very strange. Felt like I was watching a movie. I was in Philadelphia, and many of my fellow students had parents and relatives who worked at the World Trade Center. Story 88. Going to high school. I remember driving there and hearing a snippet of something on the radio, not sure what it was. As soon as I got to my first class, my teacher mentioned what happened. Other than that, it was just another school day. Story 89. I was between jobs at the time, so I was relaxing on my couch. My mother called from work to tell me we were being attacked and to turn on the news. Story 90. Eating a bowl of cereal at the coffee table in the living room. I turned on the television to wait for The Price is Right to start and was greeted by the news broadcast. Story 91. My husband and I had worked the night shift the night before. His ex started calling our place while we were trying to get some sleep. She must have called about 30 times that day. He could not ignore her calls because they have a child together. I turned on the television, and all the news channels were covering the story. We watched the second plane hit on live television. I remember telling him we are at war. Story 92. I was at work in the United Kingdom. A coworker told me a plane had flown into one of the towers. At that time, they thought it was a small light aircraft that hit it. Story 93. Shitting myself, literally. Not from fear, but because I was a baby. Not as in I was scared like a baby. I was a literal baby. Story 94. I was in high school. It was my freshman year. At the end of civics class, another teacher came in and told us the World Trade Center was attacked. The news was basically all anyone watched all day. Most teachers were just playing it, and all of us were glued to it. Story 95. I was in my first grade class. Every single child was taken out of class that day by their parents except me and one other child. I later learned, years later to be honest, that Flight 93 likely flew over areas where I and many people I know lived. We lived outside of Pittsburgh, And I think that is why everyone's parents took them out of school. Story 96. Standing watch on the ship's pier in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was around 4 o'clock in the morning, and things got a little crazy after that. We left shortly after the 11th on our way to the Persian Gulf. Story 97. My band had just gotten a demo deal to record with a major label producer in Chicago. It was our big break, and our flight from San Francisco to Chicago was set for the early afternoon of September 11th. We ended up driving. I was in bed with my bags already packed the night before when my phone rang. It was my friend who said, "You guys aren't going to Chicago today. Turn on your TV." Story 98. Honestly, I was in 8th grade English class when we walked in and the teacher had it on the television. No day of school in my life was ever like that. It was an event that defined so much of my life in strange ways and influenced much of the world today. Story 99. I had not yet been born, but my parents were at the San Francisco airport ready to fly back to the southern United States when it happened. Everything was canceled, and they had to rent a car a few days later to drive back to Mississippi. Story 100. High school astronomy class. Teachers entered and exited to talk. Then someone came in and turned on the television. We watched the second plane. Story 101. Working in the basement of Bethesda Naval Hospital, I was temporarily doing integration of a medical system. We received an air raid alarm, followed by a call for blood donors. Mid-morning, they told everyone to go home, but several people who had left came back, saying the roads were gridlocked. I ended up working until about 6 p.m. When I finally drove home, the roads and streets were deserted. I think I saw 5 cars driving on the Beltway and up the roads to my neighborhood. In the days that followed, we could hear military jets flying combat patrol over the city, but no other jet noise. I never realized how much the rumble of commercial jets flying in and out of all the airports was part of the background noise. I grew up in a military family. My father was a fighter pilot. The sounds of the F-16s circling the city were comforting to me. The sound of home. It disturbed my wife, though. Story 102. Buying the Slayer album that was released that day, then going in for a call center shift where basically nobody answered any calls. I just spent that night reading news websites. Story 103. Woke up to get ready for elementary school. I was confused why my family was watching a movie and why mom was still home. I was half asleep and loved school, so I just got ready and left. I had to cross a busy road known for speeders. It was empty. I gleefully skipped across the street. I ran to class because I was busy kicking a rock down the road and was about to be late. Innocent kid stuff. It was eerie. Some, I remember, were oblivious like me. Others were whispering. My teacher came in and started talking. Then the loudspeaker came on and our principal announced the third plane. My heart sank because I had just returned from New York City that Sunday. I remember going home in complete shock. My mom was not home. She was a government supervisor. Many people were traveling or commuting via Amtrak and were now stuck far from their kids. I turned on the TV, which replayed people jumping from windows. Pokemon, the main reason I got home on time, did not even play on Kids WB. Instead, there were more people screaming and jumping. Recess that day was also eerie. It was a sort of half-lockdown where we could play inside and visit other classrooms as long as we told our teacher. Nobody was playing. A few rooms had movies on. Story 104. What are you accusing me of? In all seriousness, on the bus on the way to the first class of a History of the Middle East course, let us just say the syllabus changed a lot that day. Story 105. I was working on a construction project in Indianapolis. I lived in Phoenix at the time but was there to help convert an old bank downtown into a Borders Books and Music. I had been there about a week when the September 11th attacks happened. We were watching the Today Show in the lobby of the Residence Inn while having breakfast. Then we left and walked to the site. As we were walking, we passed a news radio station that had a news ticker in the window that said, "Plane crashes into World Trade Center." A couple of us commented on it because there had been a series of small Cessna planes hitting the radio towers of skyscrapers in the past couple of years. When we got to the site, we started our morning meeting when suddenly everyone's beepers started going off. We had cell phones for the job, but at that time it was still common to have beepers. The site did not have any radios or televisions, so upon learning what was happening from friends and family who had called, a couple of us decided to walk back to the hotel and grab the clock radios from our rooms to bring to the site so we could listen to the news as it unfolded. Keep in mind that as the events of that day were happening, we did not know the extent of the situation. We did not know if it was some sort of navigation issue with the planes or coincidences with plane crashes. Terrorism was not the first thing that came to mind as it would be now. Story 106. At school in 6th grade, then that evening at Walmart getting cold medicine in a nearly empty Walmart, hearing George Bush over the intercom. Story 107. Working at my job, I was in my office planning an event and making phone calls when someone stuck their head in and said, "Hey, someone just flew a plane into the World Trade Center in New York." My mind immediately went to a small private plane. I thought, play dumb games, win dumb prizes, and went back to work. A bit later, someone else came in and said another plane just crashed and asked me to set up a television in the conference room. This was not a joke. We all stood there in total disbelief, watching it unfold on live television. Story 108. On my way to a school trip, I had to miss the first day because I was sick. My mom drove me to where my class was staying on September 11th itself. I remember watching the news report with my classmates on television in the evening. Story 109. I believe I was in a calculus class when we turned on the television and watched it for the rest of the day. Story 110. In 4th grade, I got home and my middle school-aged brother told me the Japanese were upset about Michael Bay's movie Pearl Harbor and took their revenge. Story 111. I stayed home sick from school in 8th grade, I believe. My mom woke me up after the first tower was hit and told me to come see the news. She was very worried, thinking that someone was going to bomb our small Western Prairie K through 12 school of 400 students. Then the second tower was hit and I actually saw that one live. Story 112. I was sitting at my desk in the 4th grade. I did not understand what was happening until I got home and my parents were watching the news. Story 113. I was in high school. I remember I had to go to school because my mom had to go to work. Almost all of my classes had those rolling television sets, and we mostly just watched the news all day. Except my strict algebra teacher. He made us continue doing math because he refused to let the day stop us from learning. I will never forget the callous way he dealt with a group of teenagers terrified that it was the end of the world. Story 114. Let's see, September 11th, 2001. I was in a European country where I still live, eating lunch while watching television. Lunch was a delicious frozen pizza from a brand that no longer exists. I did not realize for an instant that I was witnessing the second plane hitting the South Tower 17 minutes after the first hit the North Tower. I thought it was a strange replay of the North Tower being hit. It was my last sweet summer before university. Story 115. Woke up to a phone call from my mother telling me to turn on the news. It was my freshman year of college, sitting on the top bunk, watching the world be irrevocably changed. Story 116. In the entrance foyer of Duxford Air Museum while visiting my girlfriend in Cambridge, everyone was standing silently, staring at a small black and white television. I drove back, and every other car was full of people who looked utterly shell-shocked as they listened to the radio. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.